The city is in the grip of a devastating heroin epidemic. Public housing projects are overrun with addiction and overdoses. Law enforcement is desperate to find a solution. At the center of the state's anti-narcotics efforts is Richie Roberts, head of a special task force in New Jersey and later portrayed in the film American Gangster. Cities like Newark, Camden, and Trenton, especially inner-city areas with large minority populations, are overwhelmed by drug abuse. Addicts sleep on street corners and in abandoned cars. Used syringes are scattered throughout the streets, even in playgrounds. The scale of the crisis is hard to fully comprehend. One day, officers from Roberts' task force respond to a disturbing call. 2 deceased individuals found inside a Newark housing project. The first body discovered is a young child. In homes where both parents are addicted to heroin, children are often left to fend for themselves. In that era, it wasn't uncommon for children to accidentally ingest heroin, not because it was intentionally given to them, but because it was carelessly left within reach. The boys' parents are later found nearby, both dead from overdoses. The crisis is overwhelming, especially because it's being driven by a new, highly potent brand of heroin, Blue Magic. At the time, no one knows who is producing or distributing it. Across the Hudson River, New York City is also under siege. In the early 1970s, it was estimated that the United States had at least 500,000 heroin addicts, nearly half of them in New York alone. The scale of the problem makes enforcement nearly impossible. Heroin is flooding into the country, and the profits are so high that many are drawn into trafficking. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, is established in 1973 to combat drug-related crime. In New York, their primary target is the Mafia. The 5 major families, the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese organizations, are based in New York with nationwide operations. At the time, it's believed that organized crime groups control approximately 80% of the heroin trade. The supply route is known as the French Connection. Heroin is cultivated from Turkish poppies, processed in Marseille, France, and then smuggled into the United States, often in hidden compartments within cars. In an effort to cut the supply, the U.S. government funds the destruction of Turkish poppy fields. But unexpectedly, Blue Magic appears and floods the streets. It is purer, cheaper, and more addictive than anything that came before. New York City becomes the central hub for drug distribution. From Harlem, heroin flows to cities like Detroit and Chicago. Harlem, by the 1970s, is the epicenter. Heroin use cuts across every age group and social class. Addiction does not discriminate. For law enforcement, the key priority becomes identifying the source of Blue Magic. The DEA begins investigating the supply chain from the bottom, hoping to work their way to the top. In December 1973, 2 known Mafia-affiliated distributors, Mario Perna and Tony Vizzina, are arrested in New York. When apprehended, they are found with a massive quantity of heroin, destined for a man named Frank Lucas. Lucas had already been on law enforcement's radar since 1970, but prosecutors lacked the evidence to build a case. A search of Vizzina's apartment finally provides the breakthrough. Investigators find ledgers and contact information linking Lucas directly to the heroin operation. Under questioning, Perna and Vizzina name Frank Lucas as their supplier. With this information, authorities realize they're not dealing with a small-time criminal, but a major trafficker. Who is Frank Lucas? The story traces back 8 years. Lucas, originally from North Carolina, had been dealing heroin in Harlem since the mid-1960s. Starting as a low-level criminal, he displayed remarkable street smarts. He built his reputation in one of the most competitive and dangerous narcotics markets in the country. Initially, Lucas sourced his heroin from mafia networks. But he quickly realized that to earn real profits, he needed to move higher up the supply chain. He needed recognition and a reputation. One pivotal moment came when Lucas lent a kilo of heroin to a local gangster named Tango, expecting repayment. When Tango refused to pay, Lucas took matters into his own hands and killed him. A bold move that elevated his street credibility and status in Harlem's criminal underworld. His rise continued. 1966, Harlem, New York. Lucas is hustling pool in a club on 7th Avenue. Another figure present that night is Ice Pick Red, a notorious contract killer. When Ice Pick challenges Lucas to a high-stakes game, the atmosphere turns tense. But the situation shifts when a well-dressed man enters the room. Bumpy Johnson, a legend in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was not just a feared figure on the streets. He had close ties to the Genovese crime family. By the 1950s and early 60s, Johnson had become a central player in organized crime in Harlem, acting as a liaison between the Italian Mafia and the African-American community. Through his relationship with Bumpy Johnson, Frank Lucas gains access to high-level criminal networks. Johnson serves as both mentor and role model, and after his death, Lucas moves to fill the power vacuum left behind. But Lucas takes a different approach. Rather than rely on mafia intermediaries, he builds his own supply chain, purchasing heroin directly from Southeast Asia and smuggling it into the United States via unconventional routes, including inside the coffins of American soldiers returning from Vietnam. This direct-to-source model allows Lucas to bypass the mafia and undercut their prices. His product, Blue Magic, becomes infamous for its purity, and his empire grows rapidly. Harlem's most powerful heroin dealer heard about Frank Lucas killing Tango. Now, he wants to test Frank against a real enforcer. He asks Frank, "Can you beat this guy?" Frank replies confidently, "Yes, I can." The dealer decides to back him, and Frank delivers. He dominates the encounter and wins the money, proving himself to Harlem's most feared figure. This victory pays off immediately. Bumpy Johnson, the legendary Harlem gangster, takes Frank under his wing. Johnson supposedly teaches him how to operate like a true gangster. A turning point in Frank's criminal career. Harlem, New York, 1970. 4 years after becoming Bumpy Johnson's trusted associate, Frank Lucas is left to fill a power vacuum when Johnson dies at the age of 62. Now, Frank is not just a street-level dealer. He becomes the most powerful man in Harlem's heroin trade. He seamlessly takes over Johnson's role in the mafia supply chain. Frank begins working with Ralph Ditino, a high-ranking member of the Lucchese crime family. Through this connection, Frank's heroin business booms, his profits surge, and he starts demanding massive quantities, sometimes receiving between 3 to 50 kilograms of heroin per week throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s. At this time, heroin use in Harlem is reaching crisis levels. Approximately 15,000 addicts live in the area, and the addiction rate is 12 times the national average. But in 1973, after the DEA dismantles the French Connection, the primary heroin route from Europe, the mafia's supply chain is severely disrupted. Heroin becomes scarce, prices rise, and Frank's profits are squeezed. Soon, he finds himself in serious debt to the mafia. Every ambitious dealer had to pay the mafia to import drugs, and their fees were steep. Frank Lucas's debts were reportedly reaching dangerous levels. DEA surveillance picked up Italian American gangsters talking about killing him. He owed them over $300,000. With mounting pressure and a supply crisis, Frank becomes desperate. He needs a new, reliable source of heroin to feed his network. Starting in the early 1970s, many dealers began seeking alternative supply lines. When Blue Magic appears on the market, it's clear they've found it. And Frank is making more money than ever. January 1973. Frank's heroin cutting operation is running at full capacity. He employs people to professionally dilute and package the heroin, ensuring quality control. His goal is simple: dominate the market. He does this by offering a higher purity product. In some areas, heroin was being sold with only 1 to 3% purity. Frank's product was closer to 10%. Addicts preferred it. It delivered a longer, more intense high. His branding strategy was also critical. He called his heroin Blue Magic. Buyers specifically asked for it by name. Even when cut, Blue Magic provided a better experience than competitors' heroin, and it was making Frank Lucas extremely wealthy, bringing in at least $1 million in cash per week in profit. But the potency came with a deadly cost. When Blue Magic hit the streets with 6 to 10% heroin content, users who were accustomed to much weaker doses began to overdose in large numbers. The high quality caused mass addiction, but also a public health crisis. Still, users kept demanding it because it delivered the strongest high. August 1973. Frank's operation is now bigger than law enforcement had anticipated. Blue Magic is no longer limited to New York. It's flooding into New Jersey as well. Frank's family handles the distribution. His 17-year-old nephew and his brother, Shorty Lucas, lead the operations. Together they form a group called the Country Boys. Shorty quickly gains a reputation as a violent enforcer, even more ruthless than Frank. Dealers who undercut or disrespected the operation were dealt with brutally. Bodies were found at the base of high-rise housing projects. Some victims had been thrown from rooftops. Shorty consolidates control by eliminating rival dealers and replacing them with loyal members from their home state. Cutting and packaging operations were scattered across different locations. New sellers, many with southern accents, began appearing across New Jersey. It wasn't hard to identify who was behind it. Harlem, 1973. With Blue Magic, Frank has completely turned his fortunes around. His wealth is staggering. An estimated $50 million hidden in Cayman Islands bank accounts. He lives lavishly, spending freely at Harlem's famous nightclub, Small's Paradise. Frank becomes known for his extravagant lifestyle, which soon attracts the attention of the DEA and the federal government. This is when Richie Roberts enters the story. A DEA associate invites him to a club in New York where Frank is holding court. "I remember the first time I saw Frank," Roberts recalls. "Everyone knew who he was. People came over to shake his hand. If you want to keep a low profile, that's not how to do it." But Frank, well-dressed, surrounded by beautiful women and associates, clearly thought of himself as a legitimate businessman. Frank considered himself a trailblazer, a black man succeeding in what had traditionally been a white-dominated criminal enterprise. He was charismatic despite being illiterate. He couldn't read or write, but he knew how to count money very well. But Roberts wasn't fooled. "Frank was no polished gentleman," he says. "He didn't wear Armani suits or quote philosophy. He was a killer. Everyone feared him. That's how he made money and maintained control, through violence and intimidation." Frank Lucas might have liked to portray himself as a sophisticated businessman, but everyone around him knew the truth. He was dangerous, not refined, not highly intelligent, but a brutal force on the streets, a menace. Many people feared him. Richie Roberts personally witnessed how much money Frank Lucas was making, but he still didn't know where the heroin branded as Blue Magic was coming from. The investigation intensified. Newark, New Jersey, 1974. Heroin overdoses were on the rise. In response, Richie Roberts assembled a group of investigators known as the Z Team to crack down on Frank Lucas. "We wanted to know where they were cutting the drugs. We wanted to know how they were distributing it. We wanted to understand how Frank was able to maintain such control." said Roberts. He sent a sample of blue magic for laboratory analysis. The results were alarming. The heroin was far purer than average and, according to chemists, originated from Asia. This gave them an early indication of the poppy cultivation region, but not how it was getting into the United States. Only Frank knew the answer, and Roberts was determined to uncover it. Meanwhile, both the DEA and NYPD were also investigating Frank Lucas. However, due to widespread police corruption at the time, information wasn't being shared. "We didn't trust each other," one agent recalled. "We didn't know how close they were to indictments, and they didn't know what we were doing either." In the end, it wasn't Richie Roberts but the New York authorities who reached Lucas first. January 18th, 1975. Frank Lucas was at home with his wife, Julie, when law enforcement executed a search warrant. Their goal was to find evidence linking Lucas to a major heroin operation. What they found exceeded expectations. Agents discovered nearly $585,000 in cash, hidden throughout the house. Lucas's wife even tried to throw several $100,000 out the window in front of DEA agents. This evidence became crucial in court. Frank Lucas and his wife were charged. Frank for heroin distribution and conspiracy, Julie for obstruction of justice. 1976, with Lucas sentenced to 40 years in prison, authorities hoped the blue magic heroin would disappear from the streets. But it didn't. Someone else had taken over the distribution. Then came a tip. Roberts' team learned that a package was en route from North Carolina to an apartment in Newark. Though they had allowed previous packages through in hopes of tracing the source, this time they decided to act. "I said, take it down. If we let it hit the streets, people would die," Roberts explained. When the Z team raided the apartment, they found Frank Lucas's street crew still active. They seized $10 million worth of heroin and arrested multiple suspects, including Frank's 17-year-old nephew. Facing life in prison, the teenager cooperated, providing detailed information on the drug operation, from street dealers to Frank himself. Based on this testimony, Lucas received an additional 30-year sentence, bringing his total to 70 years. With no realistic hope of parole, he made a choice. He flipped. Frank Lucas testified against a network of corrupt police officers and, as a result, eventually walked out of prison a free man. This is how the story was portrayed in the film American Gangster, but the truth was more complex. The real mystery investigators were trying to solve was this: where was blue magic really coming from? Frank eventually admitted it wasn't just a local operation. Blue magic was being sold across the country, even reaching California. Desperate for leniency, Frank gave them what they needed. He testified that he traveled to Bangkok, Thailand, to bypass the Mafia and establish a direct heroin supply chain into the United States. The route the heroin took was extraordinary. 1972, 3 years before his arrest, Frank Lucas was heavily in debt to the Mafia and hiding in a safe house. That's when he met a heroin importer who offered him a deal that could make him rich and independent from the Mafia. They likely met through a mutual acquaintance from the South. The importer claimed to control a $50 million heroin network operating out of Southeast Asia. Frank saw the opportunity. This was the beginning of blue magic, heroin of such high quality that it could be cut multiple times and still be potent, maximizing profits. So before leaving, Frank asked the importer for help, settling his Mafia debts. The man loaned him $25,000, a calculated risk that paid off. Frank became one of the biggest heroin dealers in the world. He later revealed that the real mastermind behind the blue magic pipeline was Leslie Ike Atkinson, a man already in custody by that time. Within just 2 years, Frank Lucas was immensely wealthy, but he wasn't satisfied. He wanted more power, more influence, and ultimately, it cost him everything. When Ike Atkinson's second-in-command was sent to prison, Frank Lucas saw his chance. He traveled to Thailand to make an offer he believed Ike couldn't refuse. Bangkok, Thailand, Frank visited Ike's headquarters, the American Star Bar, to propose a business partnership. Ike listened, but he had always been cautious of Frank. He agreed they could work together, but on his terms. Ike didn't want Frank involved in his internal operations. Instead, he offered him a role as a street-level distributor in Harlem. "I'll be the boss. I'll control the supply. You'll get the product, but you won't be the only one I'm dealing with." It was a rejection Frank never forgot. He knew he had just lost access to millions of dollars in potential profits. Years later, in an interrogation room, Frank would retaliate, not with violence, but with words. He began to tell law enforcement the full story behind Blue Magic and the man behind it all, former U.S. Army Master Sergeant Ike Atkinson. Vietnam, 1968. The war raged on, and Ike Atkinson saw a unique opportunity. Teaming up with former Army Associate Herman Jackson, Ike began sourcing high-grade heroin from the Golden Triangle, Laos, Burma, and Thailand. Together, they started smuggling the drugs back into the United States using military aircraft. Atkinson initially smuggled heroin himself, using military transport. It worked. Encouraged by success, he expanded the operation, recruiting a network of active-duty GIs to carry heroin back home while on leave. U.S. military command, focused on the war effort, failed to notice what was happening. Over the next 4 years, suspicion grew among authorities. It became clear heroin was entering the country through military channels, but no one knew exactly how or who was behind it. Atkinson preferred it that way. As scrutiny increased, Ike grew more innovative. Soldiers used small leather gym bags, called AWOL bags, with false bottoms to conceal heroin. Each false bottom could hide around 700 grams of nearly pure heroin. He diversified even further. Film canisters, leg casts, hollowed-out furniture, any method that would work. Ike built a sprawling network involving at least 50 direct associates and hundreds of military personnel. Some were paid. Others had their gambling debts forgiven. All played a role. One of Ike's most ambitious schemes involved hiding as much as 100 kilos of heroin inside custom furniture. A single kilo cost $4,000 to purchase and sold in the U.S. for $100,000. Cut and diluted, 1 pure kilo became 4 kilos of lower purity heroin, each selling for $25,000. Demand soared. Ike had customers along the entire East Coast, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., and even on the West Coast. From 1968 to 1975, the DEA estimated he made around $400 million, equivalent to over $1.2 billion today. The DEA called it one of the largest heroin smuggling operations in history. Ike had the product, and in the drug world, the one with the product holds the power. While avoiding the DEA, Ike continued using military flights to move heroin into U.S. bases for years, until Frank Lucas brought it all crashing down. June 1975. Frank Lucas gave investigators critical information. The remnants of Ike's smuggling network were arrested. "As far as I know, and as the feds told me," said one agent, "Frank gave up everyone. His partners, associates, people in other organizations, over 100 individuals were convicted." Charged with trafficking, Ike's full network came to light. It was worth an estimated $50 million a year, yet few outside law enforcement even knew his name. That anonymity had been the secret to his success. Why? Because Ike and his associates were military men. They had access to planes. No one questioned them. It was the perfect cover. Eventually, Ike pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. The combined efforts of Richie Roberts' OZ team in New Jersey and the DEA in New York brought down both Ike and Frank's networks. Frank's cooperation reduced his 70-year sentence to just 6. He was released in 1981. The kingpin of Harlem, once the most feared heroin dealer on the streets, linked to violence, extortion, and murder, was now a free man. "It paid off for him," said one investigator. "He got out early." Frank Lucas was undoubtedly one of New York's top heroin dealers, but he didn't control the pipeline from Asia. That was Ike Atkinson's domain. Frank's life story inspired American Gangster, but the truth differed from the film, and Frank's criminal life didn't end there. Within 3 years of his release, he was arrested again, this time for heroin distribution. He served a full 7-year sentence and was released in 1991. Ike, meanwhile, received an additional sentence while in prison for continuing his drug operations from behind bars. In total, he served 32 years and was released in 2007, the same year American Gangster premiered. That year, Richie Roberts got a call from Ike. He said, "Frank didn't do most of that. I did. I ran Asia. I never got credit." Then Ike joked about seeking revenge. He said he was going to kill Frank, Roberts recalled. I said, "Ike, how old are you?" He said, 80. I said, "You're not killing anyone. Get a rocking chair." And we both laughed. Ike Atkinson died in 2014 at the age of 88. Frank Lucas, also 88, lived longer, but his legacy remained tied to the man who had truly built the empire. With connections through Bumpy Johnson and street muscle in Harlem, Frank Lucas rose to power. But he didn't create the empire, he distributed it. The real American Gangster was Ike Atkinson. For a decade, his military smuggling network brought Southeast Asia's heroin into the U.S. with astonishing reach and precision. Until Frank brought him down, Frank Lucas was just his man in New York.